A popular depiction of angels, especially in the Western world, are these cute chubby babies with wings. Statues and paintings going back centuries have solidified this image in our minds and have completely changed the popular perception of biblical angels and especially the cherub. This wasn't always the case, however, and in this video we'll see how these beings are supposed to look based on scripture, how the people of antiquity perceived them, and how that perception changed to what it is today. The first mention we have of the cherubim comes from what you could call the very beginning. In Genesis, the cherubim were placed by God to protect the Garden of Eden and the way to the Tree of Life itself. In the book of Ezekiel, they are described as being the ones who transport the throne of God, and in Isaiah, it is upon the cherubim that the throne of God is located. Perhaps even more famously, in the book of Exodus, it is described that 2 cherubim were placed on each side of the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. From these descriptions, we can understand that the cherubim served the roles of servants to God, and primarily guardians. From this you can get the idea that they were likely not babies with wings. The most famous biblical description we have of the cherubim is located within the book of Ezekiel, and specifically chapter 1 verses 5 to 11, which said, "And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their 4 sides they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead, they did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. They each had 2 wings spreading out upward, each wing touching that of the creature on either side, and each had 2 other wings covering its body." This description is what came to be known as the tetramorph, which in Greek means 4 forms. The animals chosen to describe the angel are precise, and each of them are interpreted to embody different traits or aspects of God's rule. Now later on in Ezekiel, in chapter 10 verse 14, there is a slight alteration in that description. Whereas the forms of the lion, the eagle and the man remain, the face of the ox is transposed with that of the cherub. Ezekiel nevertheless goes on to confirm in later verses that the description we just read earlier was in fact of the cherubim. Or at least, this is one of the most widespread interpretations of what exactly Ezekiel was describing, and therefore it is based on those verses that the cherubim came to be visualized. In fact, it is from the book of Ezekiel that the popular image of the incomprehensible, biblically accurate angel comes from, which also goes on to mention the cherubim specifically, and is perhaps the reason why angels throughout the Bible warn their witnesses not to be afraid. In chapter 10 verses 9 to 16 it says, "I looked, and I saw beside the cherubim 4 wheels, one beside each of the cherubim. The wheels sparkled like topaz. As for their appearance, the 4 of them looked alike. Each was like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the cherubim faced. The wheels did not turn about as the cherubim went. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced, without turning as they went. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. I heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels. Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. One face was that of a cherub, the second the face of a human being, the third the face of a lion, and the 4th the face of an eagle. Then the cherubim rose upward. These were the living creatures I had seen by the Cavara river. When the cherubim moved, the wheels beside them moved, and when the cherubim spread their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels did not leave their side." Generally, the tetramorph as a symbol had been used for centuries throughout Mesopotamia, and in the Christian era even came to represent the 4 evangelists, meaning Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. Regardless, this description, while physically incomprehensible, makes more sense as to the role of the cherubim in guarding the Garden of Eden and even the throne of God himself, or the Ark of the Covenant. Now, with the cherubim being one of, if not the most mentioned being in the Bible, as well as one whose form was mentioned to embellish the Temple of Jerusalem, countless different visual interpretations arose as Christianity grew under the Roman Empire. The majority of these interpretations relied solely on the verses of Ezekiel, and thus, for over 1,000 years, the illustration of the cherubim was at least partly inspired by scripture and portrayed as this hybrid creature. Without this meaning, of course, that there had not been any other depictions, such as angels looking like human men or men with wings. Having said all of this, how did their perception change into flying babies, and why? Well, in Italy, primarily during the Renaissance, the depiction of the putti became popular. The putti, or singular putto, were those chubby little babies that often had wings, and their popularity in the art of the Renaissance grew exponentially. The tradition of the putti in art actually began during the Roman times, and they would be depicted performing a variety of activities, from dancing and singing to fighting, often decorating the sarcophagi of children. These ancient forms of babies would go on to represent mythological figures, such as that of Eros or Cupid, as well as all sorts of messenger spirits associated with the pagan gods during the Greco-Roman period. This artistic tradition would largely disappear with the end of the classical Roman period and almost entirely cease during the Middle Ages. However, with the Renaissance and rekindled interest in Roman history and art, Italian artists would, again, make the putti popular. One of the single most influential contributors to bringing them back was none other than Donatello, who would use these forms in a now Christian setting instead of a pagan one, and has thus been credited as being the father of this artistic depiction. Works such as Madonna with 4 cherubs, which now depicted the cherubim as the once again popular putti, would cause these types of angels to become synonymous with the form of the winged baby of antiquity. Donatello's artistic influence would then have an impact on artists such as Raphael and the Sistine Madonna, which showcased perhaps one of history's most famous depictions of the cherubim as 2 winged babies. During this period, we also see them appear in numerous tombs and were meant to celebrate life in the face of death. This depiction spread like wildfire within the context of the Renaissance artistic expression, and from Italy it spread to the rest of Europe and by extension the entire Western world. The newly invented baby cherubim also caused angels in general to be perceived in this way, owing to the fact that they were the most commonly mentioned type of angel throughout the entirety of scripture. This trend may have been caused or at least influenced by the general artistic trends of the time in depicting more realistic human forms. As we mentioned earlier, the traditional understanding of the forms of angels within the Bible was rather difficult, with other types of angels, such as the seraphim for example, having 4 wings to cover their entire body, and 2 wings to fly, while the only thing you could see was its floating head. Naturally, the cherubim of the Islamic and Jewish traditions are different to the Christian and to each other. This is the case both in appearance, but also the role that these angels have in heaven, and also vary based on the text. For example, in Islam, their primary purpose is to sing the praises of God in heaven. Nonetheless, I hope I've now helped you understand how the cherubim changed throughout the centuries, at least in the context of Christian history and Western art, and primarily how they became babies. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.